Hey guys, good morning. I wanted to share with you all this week something I've been reading. I'm sort of finishing up my Bible reading plan. I don't know actually when this is gonna, when you'll see this, but in my life, it's right. I mean, we're 3 days from Christmas, finishing up a year-long Bible reading plan that I've been doing. Something that kind of took me from the beginning to the end in order, which is the first time I've ever done that. I've always been a guy that like sort of Picassoed that thing and read all over the Bible. So it's been fun. It's been challenging to read progressively through, and so it's really interesting for me as I finish the Bible that I hit First and Second Timothy, and then we hit James, and then First and Second Peter. Which, if you know anything about those three books, James, First and Second Peter, it's almost all about persecution. And about like both personal trial and then suffering and persecution from the world coming to you. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about what that looks like to be an American and to be persecuted, how different that is if I were Chinese or in the Middle East, what that would look like as a Christian. But as I was reading James, I hit James 1, and there's a section at the beginning of James 1 that I think is incredibly insightful. I just to be honest with you guys, it was pretty convicting for me to read, and so I just wanted to share some of that conviction with y'all. It comes right out of James 1. James, if you know anything about James, the author of the book is the brother of Jesus. So all of the mess that comes with being the brother of the Messiah, I mean, you can never be right. Like, your brother's always right? And or that he's running around at a pretty young age saying he's the savior of the world. As an older brother, I'm just, and he was younger, I'd be like, what? Who? What? And so we see James eventually come to faith later in Jesus' life when Jesus rises from the dead, and he goes, oh, like that, like I imagine his head going, oh, he wasn't kidding. Like, that's real life. That really happens. And so I always find it interesting to read James because he has probably one of the clearest insights into who Jesus was of any of the writers of the Bible. So anyway, in James 1, he's talking about specifically talking about temptation and personal persecution, meaning like, hey, what do I bring on myself as far as my own sin and my own temptation? And I couldn't help but want to share this with you. So let's look at James chapter 1, verse 13. He says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. Verse 14. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. 15 says, then the desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. And so I read that and I think, gosh, there's a lot going on there, talking about my sin and my temptation and my desire for sin. And I see three major things that I want y'all to pick up on. And the first one starts in verse 13 when he says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. Like, big point number one, God doesn't tempt us to sin. Like, he can't be associated to sin. He can't have an affiliation to sin. He is all good all the time. There is not an ounce or an inkling of sin or evil in him. He cannot be associated to it, so he would never tempt or lure his people to sin. That doesn't work. That is not to say that he doesn't test his people. So look at examples like Abraham when he is tested in his work with the Israelites, or Joseph when he was tested and thrown into slavery and asked to be faithful, and then falsely accused of raping Potiphar's wife, and to ask to be faithful, and then eventually, like, he is testing his faithfulness, and then God reveals all those things to him. Or Job, another great example of someone whose faithfulness was tested but was not tempted to sin. There's a big difference in being tested by God to strengthen our resolve, to sanctify us, make us more holy, and to test our faithfulness than to be tempted towards sin. God does not tempt, he tests. So if you're in the middle of something that seems pretty aggressive, you find yourself sinning a lot, or find yourself sinning around a particular issue, then that is not from God. Like, don't look to God and wonder why. Heck, I just can see, I know I've done this, right? Like, God, why are you keep tempting me this way? Why do you keep bringing this into my life? Like, that is not God. That is not God doing that. He cannot do that. He is so good and too good to be able to even be associated to sin. And then And so the second piece of that is in verse 14, he says, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Two things about that. One, lured and enticed. Like I like to fish. So I think about this from a fisherman's perspective. That what causes fish to be caught if I'm fishing for them? Well, I throw a lure out to them. Maybe it's a rattle trap, maybe it's a worm, maybe it's a cricket, whatever it is. I throw it out and it tempts them to bite. Right? Their desire for food tempts them to bite, and then they get caught in a trap that eventually leads to death. I think that's an interesting analogy there. Right? Our sin is the same way. Right? It's thrown out in front of us. Right? Satan throws this trap out in front of us, and we're enticed and lured to it by our own desire. It's not anything that somebody else put on us. It's not anything else that somebody like waved their wand and cursed us with. It is the desire of our heart that causes us to sin. I wrote down that it's our own want of pleasure and attention and acceptance and the false promise that these things give us. Right? We believe that, man, that sin, whatever it is, that girl, that relationship, that drink, that money, that job, whatever it is, we're enticed to do things to gain that because we think it'll fulfill us. We think that it'll give us the hope and the pleasure and the acceptance and the attention that we so desire. And what's the truth of sin? It always fails. Like it's a false promise. Sin is a false promise. Satan tricks us. He lures us and entices us by the desire in our heart to believe that sin will do all these things for us. And when we get them, when we do fall into sin, right? We do whatever that our heart desires, the passions of our flesh, Ephesians 2, right? What happens? It doesn't fulfill us. Like it leaves us empty and wanting and desiring more sin. And so I look at verse 14. I'm like, Spencer, man, it is not anybody else's fault that you sin. Like it's yours. It's yours alone, right? Satan lays a trap and you jump right in it. And so one of the things I've been doing just to counter that pretty regularly is when I read and pray in the mornings, I ask God at the front end of that time, like, hey, Lord, may you make this time be clarifying for me and to kill I say these words, like kill the enchantment of my heart with sin, right? Like, and that's what I would hope you would do. Like use the Bible, use your time in prayer to kill that desire, that lure, that enchantment that for sin and twist it and change it so that it is properly put in its place. Desire is good, right? As long as it's a desire for Jesus. And I pray pretty continuously that Lord would make that desire that I have for sin to be desire for things that are not sinful. Help me find that affection. Help me find that pleasure and attention in Jesus, right? Psalm says that the pleasures of God are at his right hand, right? That there is hope at his right hand. And so may I find those things I'm looking for, not in the traps and the lures set by Satan, but may I find hope and affection and attention and love and hope and pleasure. Like, may I find those things in Jesus. And that's my prayer pretty continuously, is that I would not fall trap to the lure and the desires set by Satan, but I would turn my affections and my heart to Jesus, and he would be the fulfillment of those things that I desire. And then the third thing is sort of a warning from Peter. I'm not going to spend from James. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this one. This is pretty graphic, and I think it makes its point just by reading it. But what happens when we do give ourselves to the desire of sin? What happens when we do give ourselves over to the temptation that Satan lays before us? Verse 15 says, "Desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." And I'm going to be as honest as I can be. I think that sometimes means actual death. That if we give ourselves to sin, it can actually lead to physical, put you in the grave, death. We've seen this, gosh, in so many instances where people have believed the lie that they're not worth it, or people have believed the lie that they're not valuable, or that nobody loves them, and it leads to suicide, right? Like that's them giving themselves to the sin. and Satan using that sin to kill them. We've seen this with alcohol and substance abuse. People give themselves over to those sins, and it leads to physical, like actual lay me in the ground death, right? But that's some cases. Sin always, 100% of the time, leads to spiritual death. Sin is a wedge that we drive between us and Jesus, and that kills and hurts our relationship with Christ. It kills our growth in Christ. It kills our affection and our intimacy with Christ. It essentially drives a giant wedge between what is life and in many ways puts death in our lives. And I like to think of, we sometimes we handle sin as Christians like it's a pet, right? Like, oh, I'll just keep it controlled. Like, I'll make sure and kind of train it, and I'll keep it in this area of my life, and I'll keep it under control. It'll stay there, and it won't infect the rest of my world. Like, it's like a puppy. Like, I'm gonna train it to not do those things. I'm gonna teach sin how to. I'm not gonna let it impact my life. I'm just gonna keep it in one little pen, one little phase, one little corner of my life. But sin doesn't work that way. Sin's like a cancer. Like, if you let any part of it in your life, it doesn't stay stagnant. It grows and grows and grows. That's what he says. Like, sin, when it comes to full conception, when it's fully conceived, gives birth to death. It doesn't stay small, right? What do we do when we find out we have stage 1 cancer in something? We kill it. We need to have that same attitude towards sin, right? Sin is not a puppy to be played with. It's a cancer to be killed. And so that's what I think when I look at James and I think about what James is trying to tell us here is, hey, a lot of times persecution and a lot of times the hardship that comes in our life isn't because of outside sources. It really isn't. It definitely isn't because God is tempting us. Sometimes it's not even that other people are testing us. It's our own desire and affection for sin that causes hardship. And so my hope this morning and for y'all is that you would look at those sins in your life that you've given a place, that you've given a place in your life. I look at my life and think about the things that I've given a place in my heart, and man, rip those things out of there. Confess that to somebody. Let somebody see it. Somebody see the nasty depths of that sin, and rip that crap out of your life, because it will grow, and it will, James 1, lead to death. And so my hope is that y'all would walk in intimacy and relational intimacy with Jesus and get rid of the things that would prevent that. So love you guys. Talk to you next week.